When former German U-boat mechanic Klaus Richter arrived at a prison camp in the scorching Texas desert, he expected chains and starvation. Instead, the Americans gave him clean clothes, an unlimited plate of food, and then issued a baffling, mandatory order: a full, hot shower every single day in fresh, clean water. For a man whose entire wartime existence was built on fighting for every drop, the enemy's act of casual, arrogant waste was the most strategic, disorienting weapon he would ever encounter. The only sound for days had been the rhythmic clatter of steel wheels on the rails, a grinding reminder that he was now a captive rolling deeper into enemy territory. He had spent the last 3 months in the tight, oil-slicked hull of a U-boat, where water was not a commodity, but a prayer whispered during deep-sea patrols. Every drop was rationed, recycled, and fought for. This scarcity was the foundational gospel of the war he had fought. Now, as the train groaned to a crawl near the border of Texas and Oklahoma in the autumn of 1944, the propaganda began to clash violently with reality. German radio broadcasts had assured him that America was a hollow shell, a land of decadent factory slaves whose industrial might was fragile. He expected to see barren plains and terrified civilians. Instead, he saw vast, unimaginable plains stretching to a horizon so wide it dwarfed the European landscape he knew. And then he saw the grass. It was impossibly green. In the middle of the arid, dust-choked west, stretching out beside the tracks near the camp boundary, were fields that glowed with an unnaturally vibrant emerald hue. He stared, utterly confused. In Germany, every inch of soil was devoted to survival crops, and any excess water was criminal waste. Here, in the belly of the American desert, they were growing grass merely for the sake of it. Klaus, a man dedicated to closed systems, saw only strategic stupidity. This, he thought, was the carelessness of a nation that didn't know how to fight a real war. The air was thick with the dry scent of mesquite and heat. When the train finally stopped, the doors slid open, revealing an American guard, not a shouting lunatic, but a young man in a starched uniform leaning against a boxcar, chewing gum with a lazy precision. The German prisoners filed out into the dusty yard. They expected the harsh bark of orders, but the voice that greeted them was calm, slow, and strangely musical, the drawl of the American South. The air was silent except for the wind and the distant, deep hum of machinery. It was this sound that drew Klaus's attention, a steady, confident thrumming beneath the ground. The camp was not a crude collection of tents. It was a sprawling, orderly installation. The wire, though intimidating, was expertly strung, taut, and professional. Klaus looked down at the dust on his boots, then back at the unnatural green of the grass field, realizing with a cold jolt that his enemy was not a monster, but an engineer. He was a prisoner in a land that seemed to reject the very concept of scarcity. What was the purpose of winning a war if the enemy possessed such a careless, arrogant supply that they could waste water just to keep their grass green? The questions started to churn in Klaus's mind, questions that propaganda had never prepared him to answer. He had arrived bracing for a cage of steel and fire, but instead he was met by a landscape that felt too confident, too abundant to truly feel like a prison. The first profound shock the prisoners felt was the silence, a stillness broken only by the low, continuous metallic hum of American infrastructure working confidently. The men had braced for rattling chains. Instead, they were processed with cool, bureaucratic efficiency. This was not the chaotic prison of German imagination. It was a logistics operation. The POWs were marched to their barracks, and Klaus noted the details with the trained eye of an engineer. The buildings were orderly, standardized, and most astonishingly, clean. Each man was assigned a bunk, handed a new uniform, and given a thick mattress and fresh blankets. The rules, posted in both languages, emphasized compliance with the Geneva Conventions. Every tenet of the Reich's propaganda, which depicted the Americans as barbaric torturers, was being calmly undone by a sheet of paper. Then came the mess hall. The abundance was staggering. It was not thin, watery soup. They were served white bread baked fresh, mounds of butter, potatoes, and actual portions of beef stew. The liquid in their mugs was real coffee, strong and aromatic. The POWs ate in a stunned, suspicious silence. This was not food for beaten men, it was fuel for workers. But the moment that truly dismantled Klaus's reality came when he was directed to the wash-house. He had been prepared for a communal latrine pit. Instead, he found rows of gleaming white porcelain fixtures, sinks with brass taps that ran clear water, and individual toilets. The air was dry and clean. To Klaus, a man who had scraped every speck of rust from the U-boat's metal, this was an obscene display of luxury. He calculated the weight of the water, the metal of the pipes, and the energy to run the system. It was an investment that made no strategic sense to spend on a defeated enemy. It was here that he first saw Sergeant Miller, a tall, lean man with a deeply tanned face and the calm, steady eyes of someone who had seen hard work. Miller, speaking slowly through an interpreter, confirmed the rules of sanitation. He didn't lecture. He simply stated the requirements with the bored confidence of a man checking off a list. The sheer normalcy of the place was more unnerving than any threat. Klaus was confronted by an opponent whose power seemed to stem from an inexhaustible confidence, a system so robust that it could afford to be kind. The final directive came before lights out. The men were to report to the wash-house after the morning roll call. They were going to shower, they were going to use fresh water. The word shower hung in the dusty air, promising a luxury that felt dangerous, a strategic betrayal of everything Klaus knew about survival. Would you like to hear how Klaus and the other prisoners reacted to the mandatory showers? Subscribe now to ensure you don't miss the rest of this incredible historical narrative. The assembly the next morning was not a show of force, but a demonstration of cold, unrelenting American obsession with logistics. The prisoners stood at attention, yet the American officers spoke only of one subject: sanitation. A young lieutenant, crisp and precise, detailed the daily requirements. Every man would be required to maintain a high degree of personal cleanliness. Clothes were to be washed regularly, and most importantly, every prisoner, every single day, would take a shower. The officer emphasized the words cleanliness and fresh water with a tone that suggested this was a matter of national security. For Klaus, whose existence was built on minimizing consumption, the order was a staggering strategic error, too foolish to believe. He knew what German families faced: meager weekly rations of soap and infrequent clean water. The most sacred rule of survival was conservation. To waste precious resources on cleaning defeated enemies was, in Klaus's mind, the highest form of negligence. He watched the lieutenant's face, searching for the trick. Sergeant Miller then stepped forward, holding aloft a bar of white soap. Hot water, Miller explained, would be available at set times. Each man would receive new soap when the previous one was used up. He spoke with the flat, emotionless tone of a man operating a highly regulated system. The command, demanding such a massive, deliberate expenditure of the most sacred resource, landed on Klaus as a physical weight, pressing down his confusion. This was the profound absurdity that propaganda had never accounted for. The greatest shock was the implication that this resource, fresh, heated, pressurized water, was so utterly disposable that it could be washed down the drain. It was an insult to the conservationist discipline hammered into every German soldier. They were thinking the same thing. This was a weakness to be exploited. The Americans, in their immense confidence, were failing the most basic test of wartime discipline. They were wasting water. The German mind, trained for survival in scarcity, immediately saw an opportunity. They would obey the letter of the rule, but they would not participate in the waste. Klaus clutched the bar of soap, smelling the sharp chemical scent of P&G white naphtha soap. That night, the topic of the mandatory shower dominated the hushed German conversations. They decided to resist the waste, not with disobedience, but with meticulous, secret conservation. The American officers believed they were enforcing hygiene. The German prisoners believed they were executing a mission to save resources. Klaus went to sleep plotting how to defeat the shower, determined to save every possible drop from disappearing into the drain. The real battle, he realized, would not be fought with rifles, but against the casual indifference of American abundance. That night, after the barracks lights were dimmed, the whispers began, not about escape, but about how to defeat the shower. The men had been stripped of their freedom, but the instinct for resourcefulness remained. Klaus became the quiet leader of this secret, bizarre resistance. He was a man who understood the absolute necessity of retaining every drop. His small group gathered around him to discuss their plan. They could not openly refuse the shower order, but they could refuse to participate in the waste. The idea was simple. They would repurpose empty ration tins or sturdy containers into catch basins. They would bring these into the communal shower stalls. As they stood under the torrent of clean, hot water, they would discreetly position the tins to collect the runoff. This saved water would then be utilized for a second, more necessary purpose: washing clothes, scrubbing floors, or efficiently flushing toilets, tasks they believed the Americans were too wasteful to properly manage. For Klaus and his comrades, this was a silent, principled protest. It was an affirmation that they still held onto the values of sacrifice over the American vice of careless abundance. They viewed the conservation ritual as a secret act of war, demonstrating their continued discipline. Every movement was planned with military precision. Who would bring the tins? Who would be responsible for distributing the collected water? It was a mission executed with the gravitas of a combat operation. As the barracks settled into a false calm, the men lay on their bunks, rehearsing the movements in their minds: the walk to the wash house, the swift positioning of the tin, the quick, efficient application of the soap, and the careful transportation of the salvaged water. They felt a strange sense of shared purpose, a renewed confidence derived from their own superior survival ethic. The small hard bars of P&G white naphtha soap sat beside their bunks. Tomorrow, they would have to face the impossible luxury of the torrent. The tension was not fear of American cruelty, but the intense, internal pressure of not betraying their core belief in conservation. They were ready to perform their duty, to save the precious resource, and to secretly demonstrate their moral advantage. Klaus closed his eyes, visualizing the heavy, steaming door of the wash house, knowing that tomorrow a secret battle against the flow would begin. The prisoners risked being punished to save a few drops of water. If you were in their shoes, what resource would you have felt the most pressure to save? Comment below and let us know. The first day the German prisoners were marched to the wash house, the air around the large functional structure was thick with industrial humidity. The constant audible sound of running water, a deep, confident rush, was the true shock. Klaus entered the shower room and felt the sudden blast of heated air and steam. It was immense, built for scale and volume, with rows of shower heads. There was no rationing here. The water that blasted down was hot, aggressively so. He gasped slightly at the sensory overload. It was clean, potable water, the kind one drank. He estimated the flow rate with the precision of an engineer, at least 10 gallons per minute. Quickly he bent down, keeping his back to the wide entrance, and positioned his tin to catch the initial spray. It was a nervous, clandestine act, carried out under the roaring cascade of the water itself. He lathered the strange, strongly scented soap onto his skin quickly, driven by the frantic energy of a man fighting a clock. But the sheer volume of the water defeated his conservation effort almost instantly. His tin filled in a matter of seconds, overflowing the moment he straightened up. The water rushed over the edges, joining the torrent that was disappearing down the wide, open drain. The collected water felt pointless, a pathetic teaspoon of effort against an industrial ocean. He stood there physically clean for the first time in weeks, yet mentally disturbed. He realized that the water wasn't merely running, it was being disposed of. It was being treated not as the liquid gold he knew it to be, but as mere waste product. His conscience, hammered into existence by wartime scarcity, screamed in protest. Every fiber of his being, every lesson learned in the confines of a submarine told him this was wrong, unsustainable. The Americans didn't seem to care that they were wasting it. They possessed such confidence in their own supply chain that the conservationist discipline he treasured was irrelevant to them. He quickly turned the brass faucet off, unable to endure the psychological cost of watching the pure water spiral down the drain any longer. He clutched the filled tin of runoff water like a prize, but the prize felt meaningless. He knew with sudden, clear conviction that his secret act of conservation was not defying the Americans, but simply hiding his shame from himself. The water, the endless, rushing water, was the loudest argument against the propaganda he had ever heard. Klaus was hunched over, his back aching from the quick, awkward crouch, when the water tin finally filled to the brim, the hot, fresh liquid slopping over his knuckles and joining the reckless deluge on the floor. He lifted the container, feeling a tiny surge of professional pride in his quiet act of sabotage against American waste when a shadow fell across the stall opening. It was Sergeant Miller. The American was standing casually outside the stall, watching Klaus with simple curiosity. The sergeant said something slow and easy in English. Klaus, understanding only the tone, stared back, suddenly feeling exposed and foolish. An interpreter, another young guard leaning near the entrance, translated Miller's question. "He asks what you are doing with the bucket," Klaus replied in sharp German, detailing his careful plan. He explained that this runoff water was being saved for washing and cleaning, thereby saving the real water supply. The interpreter relayed the explanation. Miller listened patiently. He then pushed his hat back slightly, walked 2 steps into the stall, and pointed down at the wide steel drain cover. "He says," the interpreter translated, "to just let it run. There is plenty more where there came from. That is why we built the drain so large." The words struck Klaus not as an order, but as a devastating statement of fact. He looked down at the drain, a hungry, unforgiving mouth swallowing the pure, hot water, and then back at the overflowing tin in his hands. His small, defiant act of conservation was revealed to be meaningless. The water he had risked confrontation to save was viewed by his captors as nothing more than necessary byproduct, something to be discarded. The realization was a profound ideological collapse. All the propaganda that had defined his wartime existence shattered against the simple, pragmatic confidence of Sergeant Miller and the careless rush of the water. The power of the enemy was not in the force of their weapons, but in the incomprehensible logistical ease with which they provided and then discarded resources. The pure, hot, clean water continued to cascade over his head, an undeniable luxury that now felt like a humiliation. It was a baptism of shame, washing away the core tenet of his professional life. The greatest defeat was not his capture, but the sheer volume of water spiraling away, uncontested, into the Texas soil. Klaus finally set the tin down, the sound echoing dully on the concrete, and simply let the water run down the drain. He had lost the secret battle. That scene, of the endless water running down the drain, is the exact moment Klaus's world shattered. This is a story that needs to be heard. Share this video right now to show others the surprising reality of war. Klaus left the wash house physically clean, but inside, a vital part of his ideological foundation felt utterly soiled. He stared out at the dusty yard, the dry Texas earth now seeming to mock the careless torrent that rushed through the drain pipe. He was compelled to seek an explanation. Later that afternoon, he found Sergeant Miller overseeing a small repair. Through the camp's interpreter, Klaus posed the question, "Why waste so much clean, hot water? In Germany, this would be an unimaginable crime." Miller listened, gave a slow nod, and looked Klaus straight in the eye. His reply was purely pragmatic. "Son," the interpreter relayed, "we didn't build this camp to harm anyone. We built it to run. A camp with clean, healthy men causes less trouble and requires fewer guards. It's efficient. We have the water, we have the pumps, we have the oil to heat it. It's cheaper to give you a shower than to fight an epidemic." The sheer cold logic of the statement was more impactful than any moralizing could have been. The abundance was not a random accident. It was an engineered advantage. The waste was simply the byproduct of a system designed to operate with such massive scale that saving a bucket of water was an irrelevance. He began to view the camp through a different lens, analyzing it not as a prison, but as a technical demonstration. The vast kitchens, capable of preparing thousands of calories of food per man, were a testament to the nation's agricultural might and its transportation networks. The regular delivery of supplies, the constant hum of the distant water pump, all spoke to an underlying organizational strength the German Reich had never possessed. Klaus realized that the propaganda had focused on the easily damaged symbols of America, but failed to acknowledge its material truth. a nation so confident in its resources that it could afford to be humane. America's power was in the unseen infrastructure that powered the water to the showerhead. He walked away from Miller, no longer seeing a jailer, but a functionary of a colossal system. The initial bitterness gave way to awe. He was forced to confront a reality that transcended his training. True military dominance lay not in the brutal art of forced conservation, but in the confident, effortless art of overwhelming supply. The enemy he had been taught to hate was less a monster and more an enormous, flawlessly running machine built to handle every contingency, including the daily cleanliness of its foes. Weeks after the revelation in the shower house, the most profoundly psychological weapon in the American arsenal arrived: the mail call. It was a chance for the German prisoners to share the truth of their captivity, a truth their families would find utterly unbelievable. Klaus sat on his bunk, the official camp stationery feeling precious. He knew every word would be read by the American censors. Yet, he felt a desperate need to convey the reality of the Texas desert. He chose to write not about the food, but about the one experience that fundamentally changed him: the water. He began, addressing his mother. "Dearest mother," he wrote, "I am alive and well. The news you receive at home about American camps is incorrect. I must tell you something you will not believe, but I swear it is true. They make us shower every day, not with cold seawater, but with hot, clean, drinking water." He paused. He knew she would envision the lines queuing for water in the rubble. He continued, "The water flows like a river into the drain. It is wasted, mother, simply thrown away. I tried to save it using a small tin to catch the runoff, but the American guards laughed and told me to just let it go. They say there is always more." The words felt like a betrayal, a confession of luxury that was offensive to the privations of his homeland. He felt a strong wave of guilt wash over him, realizing his own mother was struggling for clean water, while he, her enemy prisoner, was required to stand under a daily deluge. The water, the symbol of American power, had become the symbol of his own moral discomfort. He ended the letter with a careful evasion, but he kept the details of the shower as the core message, a quiet, coded truth. He hoped the sheer absurdity of the detail, the mandated daily hot shower, would pierce through the wall of propaganda. The next morning, the letters were collected. The young American censor who took Klaus's envelope chuckled. "Another one about the showers, huh? Ain't nobody back home going to believe all this bathing. Y'all are writing fairy tales." The casual dismissal confirmed the strange reality. The profound truth of their captivity was so far removed from the narrative of war that it was simply dismissed as impossible fiction. After the emotional confrontation with the shower, Klaus's entire perception of the camp shifted to one of pure industrial curiosity. His new assignment weeks later offered a clear vision of the source of the American abundance. Klaus and a small detachment of prisoners were driven miles from the camp into the vast, unforgiving landscape. They were assigned to a labor detail focused on maintaining a colossal irrigation system connected to a distant reservoir. When they arrived, the sight was staggering. Klaus, the U-boat mechanic who worried about saving a single bucket of runoff, was confronted with water on a scale he had never conceived. It was a man-made river, a massive, concrete-lined canal carrying an astonishing volume of water to distant farmlands. The flow was constant, powerful, and utterly indifferent to the dry earth around it. They were working near a spillway where the water descended from the reservoir, roaring with a noise that drowned out all thought. This was the origin of the clean water that simply vanished down a large, ignored drain. Klaus spent his days clearing silt and monitoring the valves. He worked alongside two elderly American civilian engineers who treated the German prisoners as temporary, necessary labor. The Americans were pragmatic, talking only of cubic feet per second, hydraulic pressure, and maintenance cost. They explained how the reservoir was fed by distant mountain snowmelt, captured and distributed across hundreds of square miles. For Klaus, this was a profound, hands-on lesson in the true nature of American power. This was an engineered dominance over nature itself. The sheer scale of the dam and the irrigation network dwarfed anything he had ever known in Germany. He was accustomed to the German value of Sparen, saving and meticulous accounting. The Americans' motto seemed to be supply, distribute, and discard. He realized that the war was being won not in battle alone, but in civilian planning and infrastructure. The water that flowed so carelessly down the drain was an advertisement. It demonstrated a logistical superiority so vast that the enemy could literally afford to be wasteful. He began to feel awe, replacing his initial anger. By the time the work was done and the canal was running smoothly, Klaus felt a deep, professional respect for the men who had built this system. His days of focusing on his small, useless bucket seemed absurdly distant. He had spent his life in a world defined by limits. Here, he saw a world defined by the ability to manufacture abundance. The memory of the clean running water would not be a reminder of defeat, but a blueprint for what a nation, fully mobilized and organized, could achieve. The journey back was marked by the hollow, mournful sound of the ship's horn across the cold Atlantic in early 1946. Klaus stood at the rail, carrying the memory of the endless torrent he had left behind. When the ship finally docked in Bremerhaven, the scene was one of utter devastation. The docks were shattered. The air smelled of ash and stagnant water. Hundreds of people were queued in a long, silent line, each clutching a bucket, waiting for a trickle from a single communal water spigot. The contrast to the industrial flow of Texas was immediate and heartbreaking. Klaus, physically fit and well-fed, walked through the ruins of the city. His first impulse was to look at the failing infrastructure. His engineer's eye was drawn to every broken pipe, every corroded valve, every drop of precious water that was being wasted, not by abundance, but by disrepair. He found himself walking past a crumbling factory wall where a small pipe, ruptured by frost, was weeping a steady stream of potable water into a mud puddle. The locals walked past it, resigned to the loss. But Klaus could not bear the sight. He stopped, dropped his thin canvas bag, and immediately set to work. He saw the water pooling in the mud, and in that moment he realized this leak was the very same strategic error he had witnessed in Texas, now happening on his own soil due to failure, not abundance. He was fixing a minor leak in a ruined city, but it felt like the most important duty of his life. Using salvaged metal and twine he had kept from the camp workshop, he began to make an improvised repair. He worked quickly, applying the logic of simple, efficient civilian maintenance he had learned from the American engineers. An elderly woman waiting in the water queue watched him. "Why are you working on that, young man?" she asked. "It has been leaking since last month." Klaus wiped the mud from his brow. "Because water should not be wasted. Not one drop, if we can help it." The words were reinforced by the overwhelming lesson of American organization. He realized that the greatest power was not brute force, but the ability to sustain life through competent logistics. In the years that followed, Klaus did not look back to the war as a fight for ideology, but as a lesson in engineering. He became an important figure in the massive post-war reconstruction of municipal water systems in northern Germany. He applied the lessons of Texas, urging the city planners to focus not on minimal efficiency, but on resilient, large-scale supply systems. He remembered Sergeant Miller's pragmatic words, "It's cheaper to give you a shower than to fight an epidemic." By 1950, Klaus was an accomplished water management engineer. He understood that America had displayed its superiority not by cruelty, but by the quiet, overwhelming confidence of its infrastructure. The enemy had shown him how to rebuild. The German POWs who returned home with tales of endless hot water became quiet ambassadors for this new understanding, that respect for human dignity and technical competence were two sides of the same powerful coin. He had returned from captivity with a new blueprint for peace. That moment, standing under the reckless torrent of clean hot water, was the beginning of Klaus's quiet realization that the war was not just fought with tanks, but with sheer, unimaginable logistics. If this story of the German POWs and the power of American abundance opened your eyes to a lost piece of history, then please hit the like button to help us tell more stories like this. And make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next unbelievable chapter from the archives of history.